The U.S. has pulled out of UNESCO before. They pulled out back in the 80s. They rejoined in 2003. Do you think the U.S. could or should eventually consider getting back into UNESCO if things change?
Well, I don't think it's very likely at this point. The U.S. owes a lot of money. They don't want to pay that money. And
hundreds of millions of dollars.
Hundreds of millions of dollars, which was cut because the UNESCO admitted the PLO as a state, which it's not, contrary to U.S. law, which they were warned not to do. And the organization is grossly politicized on issues having nothing to do with Israel. As we exposed several years ago, they had elected Syria to UNESCO's Human Rights Committee, and they weren't able to remove them. The U.S. and the UK said they would try to remove the Assad regime. They could not. So this is just one of the worst examples of how UNESCO abuses its own mandate to promote culture.
Are they still relevant at all? This is an agency founded in the 1940s. Their mission now, I mean, does it have relevancy, or is it so politicized and so obvious in its politicization that it's not really a useful body at all?
Well, Obama speechwriter Ben Rhodes criticized the U.S. for leaving it, and indeed the mission of UNESCO is noble, just like the mission of the UN is noble. But the fact is, like other UN agencies, dictators have hijacked this agency. Iran and Sudan are members of the governing board. Prizes have been named at UNESCO for dictators like Obiang of Equatorial Guinea, who says he can kill people because God gave him the right. And they recently honored Che Guevara, the mass murderer, executioner from the Castro regime, enshrining his works as a UNESCO heritage property. So UNESCO has been absurd, and what's happened to it is very much a self-inflicted wound. Let
me bring into this conversation, Ellie. I know you've been tracking political reactions across Israel, across the region, but first a quick question. Why wouldn't Israel follow suit like immediately? Wouldn't it be a more powerful 1-2 punch if Israel and the U.S. did this together? Israel's saying we're laying the groundwork, but we're many months away from a decision.
That's the most important question of it all. And indeed, most of us would have expected Netanyahu to say that we're out of the game immediately. But the U.S. itself will not be out of UNESCO by the end of 2018. What could happen by then? UNESCO, maybe unlikely, might change its ways, and then the U.S. will not necessarily finalize this process of withdrawing, and Israel is not willing to find itself again out of the game if the U.S. might stay in. So this is why it takes time. But indeed, Israeli leaders from all over the political spectrum hailed this move, viewing it as a very brave move morally. And let's start with the Defense Minister, Victor Lieberman, again from the ruling coalition, said it's an important moral step by the United States. Definitely yet another step that signals a change when we're looking at Nikki Haley, a very different ambassador on behalf of the United States to the UN. Let's move on to Naftali Bennett, and he's also the chairman of the Israeli Council to UNESCO, and he decided to cut all the Israeli cooperation with the organization a year ago, and this indeed happened. So he too hails the move.
Yeah, we see there he's calling on Netanyahu to do more and withdraw. Just like the U.S. did, just to announce it.
Indeed, like many other Israeli lawmakers, even Avi Gabay, the leader of the Israeli Labor Party, congratulated the U.S. for doing so. And it definitely also sends a very clear message to the UN Human Rights Council, another very problematic UN body from the Israeli perspective. And it adds up to a long-standing debate here in Jerusalem on whether Israel should be part of such anti-Israeli organization or not, and this move is definitely very, very meaningful.
We're running out of time, but let me get you this last question. If Israel, the terms of anti-Semitic, anti-Israel bias, does Israel have more to gain or lose by removing itself from the game, as Ellie said, that phrase, or by staying in and trying to affect change from within these organizations and within these committees?
When you can affect change, we support engagement. The fact is that in recent years, UNESCO has attacked Israel relentlessly. The U.S. was not able to stop it. France and Sweden, France is now criticizing the U.S. decision to leave. France has voted against Israel more than even Russia, more than Hugo Chavez did, more than Syria voted against Israel. France voted against Israel. So countries like France and Swedish Foreign Minister Margot Wallström bear direct responsibility for helping destroy this agency.